Hello, hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Dragon's Lair. Today we discuss the last main member of the gang, the earthbending master herself, Toph. So, let's jump right into it, shall we? Starting off with strength. Strength. This is going to be a rather interesting statistic to fill out, because earthbending is a strength-based bending style, as well as some firebending. We're not talking about that today. So, yeah. Because earthbending is a strength-based bending style, Toph is going to have to be relatively strong. Pair that with the spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. I hope. Pair that with the fact that Toph visibly makes people like Katara, Aang, and Sokka even stronger as time goes on. Also, given the drill tank episode, where Toph is able to stop, or slow down, I should say, the drill tank for an extended period of time, kind of all works together to prove just how strong Toph is. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I'm going to have to put Toph's strength at 16 at minimum, but more likely 18 to 20. Moving into dexterity, this is a little different from most of the rest. Toph doesn't really have any glaring moments of dexterity where we can pinpoint exactly what her statistic is. You could start off with the first time we meet Toph, for instance, in the swamp, where Aang only gets a few passing glances at her and has to try to chase her through. But two things with that. First off, that's a little more movement speed than it is dexterity in and of itself, and second, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, that girl doesn't exist. I don't want to say a figment of Aang's imagination, because the episode goes into a little bit more detail and explanation of that, and a figment isn't exactly the correct description, but either way, she wasn't the real Toph. Please stand up. So moving into the next instance where you could say that Toph has a relatively high dexterity is the Earth Rumble 6 episode. If you notice, though, Toph never gets hit until Aang jumps in the ring and gets kind of a lucky shot. However, at the same point in time, Toph also attacks first every time. So that kind of puts a damper on Toph's high dexterity because Aang was the only one that got a chance to strike at her, and Aang hit her. So it's kind of that sort of thing. Aside from that, when you look at Toph's fighting style itself, she prefers to block and take strikes head-on instead of trying to dodge and weave out of the way. So because of all of that together, I've got to put Toph's dexterity at a middling number, somewhere around 8 to 12. Because it's not necessarily low, it's also not necessarily high. We never really get to see it all that much. So, can't really say it's super high.
Just a hyper-aggressive fighting style.
Yeah, it's just one of those, like, because she's in there fighting, you never really see the dexterity, because usually the fight's ended before someone gets a chance to strike her too much. Mm-hmm. And when they do get the chance, she takes it and moves on. Moving into Constitution. I've said it time and time again, and I will continue to say it time and time again. The Constitution doesn't really show up a whole lot in the show. The only instance I can think of for Constitution is, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, we should be good, is the library episode, where Toph holds on to the library by its top 100th or so, give or take. Could be closer to 1,000th. I don't know, it's not like the picture was drawn to scale. So, can't really do a whole lot with that. We're gonna go with 100th, just cause. 1,000th makes sense too. But she holds the library up by its barest of bits from the very top while it's being sunk from the equivalent of a celestial, but a spirit from the spirit world. At the same point in time, while on sand, which gives her less of an area to stand. Sand shifts and isn't her natural element. She's having a hard time seeing, she's having a hard time staying in place, that sort of thing. So yes, this works with strength, but it digs a little deeper into being able to hold yourself up into one position while something is trying to tear you down. Go back to the holding your hand above your head for an extended period of time example.
Pretty rough.
You know from experience, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, I'm gonna have to put Toph's Constitution at a 16 minimum, but more likely 18 to 20 to repeat myself from strength. Moving into intelligence. Try as I might, and given that Toph knows her stuff, Toph isn't the most intelligent of the group. She isn't dumb by any stretch of imagination, but when it comes to the generalistic creation of ideas, it's never really Toph. When it comes to thinking through a problem and outsmarting someone around them, it's never really Toph. And this kind of lends itself from the rushing in and just punching things fighting style of hers. And it's also the fact that she never is really relied on because she has someone like Sokka around to do a lot of the thinking, not all of it, but a lot of the thinking for ideas for her. So, because of that, I'm going to put Toph's intelligence at somewhat of a middling, maybe it's slightly higher, because she does know her stuff when it comes to earthbending, right? So I'm going to put it at 12. 14 not being entirely out of the picture. 10 making some sense as well.
She's more of the executioner.
Kind of, and that kind of ties in with the next stat, wisdom, where, again, she's not the wisest of the group. That has to go to Aang and Katara, but she's also not just blindly running in with no way of getting out and no way of thinking anything through. So, she knows how to put her ideas into practice, especially when they've been able to think through the plan entirely. She's very good at that. And she kind of spoke to Iroh, and that has to count for something, right? You have a conversation with Iroh, you're walking away wiser than you were when you walked in. That's just the way it goes. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I'm going to put Toph's wisdom at 14 to 16, which is middle high. So because that makes sense. Toph knows earth bending. She has her own bending style, which is listening to the earth. And she's not. She has the ability to put things into practice, I guess is the right thing to say there. So her wisdom is relatively high. It's just not quite on par with someone like Aang. That leads us to charisma. This is an interesting statistic because Toph is a small, blind girl. So you look at Toph and think, oh, something like a kobold, right? Something where there's a little, I don't want to say pity towards it, but pity towards it.
Most people pity blind people. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing. Toph goes throughout the entire show. Spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. Toph goes throughout the entire show kind of proving that just because you're blind or just because you have some sort of disability, you're not necessarily worse off than anyone else. Which is kind of a good message to send. But people, when they look at her, for instance, her parents, they saw her and they saw a small blind girl that they needed to protect and needed help. That needed help with everything. That wasn't reality. And then you get into something like intimidation being a charisma-based stat. And it's very scary when she's yelling at people. I mean, Aang echoes this sentiment multiple times during his training. So, given that, her charisma's not like the highest, don't get me wrong. She's not Miss Bard going in and getting everyone to do exactly what she wants them to do. But at the same point in time, she does have the ability to, at the very least, threaten her way through a situation. So 16 kind of makes sense. This brings me to race and class, the straightforward way. Starting off with race, human, obviously. Variant is the one that I chose because you get +1 to 2 different ability scores. You get an extra skill of your choice for proficiency. So something like intimidation makes sense, or perception if you feel so inclined, although maybe not for the blind girl. Your call, your character. That brings me to the feat of the human variant, which, this is kind of interesting. Alert makes sense for Toph, First off, you get a +5 bonus to initiative, which is, it's useful. I mean, not the worst thing you can have, right?
Pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, especially for someone that likes to rush into a fight. Kind of makes sense.
Being the first one to attack is always nice.
Yeah. And it goes back to the Earth Rumble 6 thing. First one to fight every time. From there, you also... What was it? It's they don't get advantage on attacking you because they're not seen by you.
By being unseen.
So that's kind of useful for the blind girl. To not just constantly be getting hit as much as she would be otherwise. This brings me to a crossroads, though. Because there is a thought, if possible, you might work with your DM, or if you are the DM, you might think of including this, to where you give Toph a feat that's homebrew. Some sort of blind sight for things that are on the ground. This makes her a little more canonical, where she can see kind of things that are around her as long as they're touching the ground, right? Because of, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, because of the Badger Mole training she got, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, but not a whole lot more detail of here in a few minutes. Because she was taught how to earthbend by Badger Mole, she's able to see through the ground, even though she's blind, through earthbending. So, giving Toph some sort of blind sight feat on things that are on the ground kind of makes sense from a show standpoint. However, this wouldn't extend to things in the air, so if she is flying, or if something around her is flying, it would be a normal perception check to see if she could find it. Unless someone pointed it out to her, which then you might forego the perception check and say she knew about where it was. That's DM discretion, though. Moving into class. I chose Ranger for the first 10 levels, which sounds kind of crazy. Allow me to explain. Rangers have the ability for favored terrain. And what favored terrain does is allows you and your party to travel through your favored terrain unhindered by difficult terrain, which sounds an awful lot like earthbending the terrain around you to make it easier for you and your party to pass through. And I stuck to level 10 to get 3 favored terrains, specifically. You also have, which I'll get into here in a second, you also have your favored enemy, which, unfortunately, you couldn't choose libraries for. So humanoid makes sense. It's kind of the second best option. However, something like Celestials, Fae, and then Aberrations, in that order, also makes sense. Because, as I said, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, should be good. As I said, the equivalent of a Celestial sunk the library her friends were in. I did say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. For favored terrains, I chose earth-based terrains, so grasslands and forests were pretty quick and easy. And then the third favorite terrain was kind of up in the air. On the one hand, you could go mountains. Makes sense. Very earth-based, and, you know, she does deal with mountains a couple of times. I chose desert, on the other hand, because in the show, mountains are kind of more reserved for the airbenders, and the desert is where Toph does a little bit of her growing. So you have the library episode, and that's kind of a big deal for her. Then you also have the drill tank, which I don't think it actually takes place in a desert. I don't think the surrounding area of Ba Sing Se is a desert, but it certainly looks like it in the show. So that's kind of neither here nor there. But I chose desert for that reason, specifically the library episode. Moving into the conceptual build for race and class, you have
the other 10 levels.
Yes, those are a little important, aren't they? Not moving into the conceptual build for race and class. The other 10 levels I chose Barbarian, which kind of makes sense because Toph rushes into things for good or for bad. I specifically went the path of the Totem Warrior there twice, because you get resistance to all damage except psychic, and then you gain more carrying capacity, and something that Toph is known for is her ability to carry her own weight. So, there's that. Now, moving into the conceptual build of racing class, unless I'm missing anything else, Chill?
No?
Thank you. For race, Earth Ganassi makes sense. Feels a little cheap. So, there's also something called a Hill Dwarf, which makes sense. Dwarves make sense with Toph's personality, specifically Hill Dwarfs, because they get Dwarven toughness. Then you have Goblins, which get Fury of the Small, and let's be honest, sometimes Toph kind of acts like a goblin would. This is probably the one I would go with, but in case you feel so inclined, you also have Stout Halflings, which are a little bit more of a stretch, but it is an option. Moving into class. Druid makes a lot of sense, specifically druids with only earth-based magic. You have to be a little careful there, because it's all nature-based. But we're talking specifically earth-based, which means not necessarily plant-based either. That's more water-bending and kind of a mix between earth and water.
Yeah.
So, something like, what is it? Move Earth?
Move Earth, yeah.
Yeah. That sort of spell, which is not really the greatest spell, but, you know.
Takes 10 minutes to do it.
And you only get a little bit done.
Mm-hmm.
You can move, what was it, a 10 foot by 10 foot area in 10 minutes, yeah.
Yeah.
Not much, not a very good spell. Oh, however, hallucinatory terrain, there we go. That makes sense too. And for the sake of building Toph as an earth-based vendor, I would allow that. So there's that. But really, any caster class makes sense for Toph, limited to earth-based magic. And if you throw in a couple of levels of martial class, it kind of meshes well with Toph specifically as a character. However, that's your call. There is another option. It's called the Inquisitive Rogue. And what that does is they gain the ability to have an easier time determining whether or not someone is lying to them and spotting people that are hidden. Which makes sense with Toph, as she's able to detect lies and see people via the blind sight that we've mentioned earlier. However, without some sort of blind sight feat, as previously mentioned, it kind of falls apart after a few levels, because a lot of the things the Inquisitive Rogue gets relies explicitly on sight. So you can have to be careful there, or have some sort of blind sight feat where that takes care of that problem. Moving into the backstory. Toph was born blind, and learned how to bend and then see from the badger moles. However, her parents didn't know this. All they knew was that they had a blind girl who they felt compelled to protect and to help. As such, they got her an earthbending teacher, master. However, Toph was restricted to just the basics. Getting tired of her parents' treatment and wanting some sort of adventure in her life, Toph went and competed in Earth Rumble 6, an Earth-based wrestling competition, for lack of a better term. She kept her identity a secret, and this is where the gang found her. They approached her and asked Toph to teach Aang how to earthbend. At first she refused, but eventually seeing a way out of her parents' treatment, we'll say, she agreed to go. This caused problems, though, as her parents were inclined to send someone after her to get her back, still wanting to protect their little blind girl. This is where Toph's story begins. Throughout the show, Toph never really has any items, so this is where I leave off for today. Did I miss anything? Do you have any disagreements? Would you like to leave a comment that's funny, or a comment that's helpful? I'm sure a DM in need will definitely be appreciative of that, and I would always love to read a funny comment. Leave it down below, please. Speaking of down below, if you can't possibly wait until my next episode, which will be on Suki, you can always come join my Discord and come hang out on Twitch. We'd be happy to have you. All links to all of my social media will be listed down in the description below, so make sure to check those out if you feel so inclined. Aside from that, I will catch you all later.